G'day and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be reviewing the Canon RF100-400 from the perspective of a wildlife photographer, because that's what I am. I've taken over 10,000 images testing this lens on a range of subjects, including wildlife, landscapes, macro, birds, kangaroos, you name it, I've photographed it, and I'll be sharing those photos in today's video. So I'm going to be answering all the common questions that you might have. That is, how is the IS, how is the AF, how is the sharpness at 400, how does it compare to all the other lenses? So this review is going to be broken up into chapters, and you can see them down the screen here, all the different things I'm going to talk about today, and they're also in the bottom of the video so you can jump ahead to a section that you're interested in. So I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, which is Skillshare. With their support, I was able to purchase this lens. I can use it, sell it, and not make a loss. So this means I've had this lens for well over a month, and it's enabled me to do a really thorough test. If I just had this on loan, I only get it for like a week to 2 weeks, and it's just not long enough for me to do these sorts of reviews. So be sure to check out Skillshare's offer later in today's video. I'm also going to make a range of raw files available for you to download so you can pixel peep at your heart's content. Okay, so let's have a chat about the actual lens itself. It's a budget telephoto lens from Canon, and it's got a focal range of 100mm, which is here, and it goes out to 400mm. It means we can kind of shoot landscapes wide, and we can shoot birds and wildlife up close. So it's a very versatile lens. So the lens is available in Canon's new RF mirrorless mount. It's not going to work on an EF mount DSLR, and it's also not an L series lens. So when I say it's budget, it means it doesn't have weather sealing. The design and the build quality of it's not quite up to the L series, but that's why it's an affordable budget lens. So we need to keep that in mind. So in regards to its size and its weight, this is what shocked me the most. This lens is so light, it's just amazing. It's 635 grams or 1.4 pounds. That is literally nothing. Probably the lightest lens I've ever used, and it's absolutely a dream for using it handheld. And when we attach it to this Canon R5 or R6, it's around 1.3 kilos. What that means is this combo is lighter than this 1DX full frame body from Canon. It's crazy that this is lighter than this camera, so it just goes to show what a weight difference there is. And when we compare it to the weight of the other 100-400 lenses, you can see on the screen just how much lighter it is. It's almost half the weight of the 5.6 fast ones, and it's about 500 grams less than the slower Tamron and Sigma. So if you want a light lens, this is definitely the one. Just in regards to its actual length or its size, it's really small. If I take this lens hood off, this is how compact this lens on a body is. This is going to go into pretty much any backpack. It's not going to take up much space, and you know, that's a really, really big advantage of this lens. And on the screen we can see how it compares to some other lenses people might be considering, the 400 5.6, the 100-500, and even original 70-200, just to give you a comparison of its size. So the other extraordinary thing about this lens is its price. It currently retails for $695 US. I think that makes it one of the cheapest 400mm telephoto lenses on the market. Definitely the cheapest from Canon. You know, they price their L series RF lenses way above the EF lenses, so it's really nice to have a budget affordable option for us as wildlife photographers. And whilst this lens is budget in price, it's far from budget in performance, which I'll share with you today. So one of the first things I noticed when I got the lens is there's actually no tripod collar or any way to mount the lens onto a tripod. So you have to mount it via the camera as you would with smaller lenses. So you know, we just have to mount it on there and then lock it into place. So I doubt many people are going to use this on a tripod or a monopod, so it's not really an issue, but just so you're aware, it definitely doesn't have that tripod collar. So the other annoyance with these budget lenses is Canon keeps omitting these lens hoods. You have to buy the lens hood separately, and that's just annoying. It should come with the lens. They can't cost that much to produce. When you buy these, I think the Canon ones might be close to $40, but I think you can pick up like third-party ones for $15 or something like that. So it's more of an inconvenience than anything. So Canon, please include them in the future. So the lens itself is actually made of engineering plastic, and look, it doesn't feel cheap. I actually quite like how it feels in the hand, to be honest. So there's very few actual buttons on the lens itself. It's got an autofocus, manual focus, it's got stabilizer on, stabilizer off. It doesn't have any focus limiting or different IS modes. It's very, very simple, pretty basic. And there is a switch, I've actually only just noticed this, on the side that says lock, and that locks it at 100mm. So the other beautiful thing about this lens is it doesn't suffer from any barrel creep whatsoever. So if I hold the lens like this, the lens barrel doesn't come out. It's kind of got a perfect tolerance that if I turn the zoom ring, it comes in, it comes out. It's actually very smooth. So the other thing these RF lenses have are the control rings that Canon have added to their lenses. This one is on the front, and I know a lot of people use this for auto ISO, where they can be shooting and they just turn it left or turn it right to change their exposure, which is pretty handy. The lens is a variable aperture lens. What that means is when we're at 100 here, we've got a 5.6 aperture, so it's letting quite a bit of light. But as we turn the zoom ring, our aperture changes, and when we get out to, what do we get to? 259 millimeters, it goes to f8, which is its slowest or its max aperture. And you know, that's kind of the focal length you'll be using the majority of the time. Well, I did. So it's quite slow at f8, and that's probably a weakness of the lens, and that might be putting some people off, but it's that f8 which allows us to have such a light and small lens. There's just no way around that. So one thing I really like about this lens are the size and position of the actual zoom ring and the manual focus ring, and I'll explain why that's important. With our mirrorless bodies, as you know, we sometimes get that background lock, which I've talked about, whereas if the camera focuses on the background, it can't really see the subject. And I have got now that I turn the manual focus when I'm in autofocus. So if I'm in autofocus, these lenses allow manual override, which means that you can change the focus, the camera can see the subject, and away you go. So when I'm shooting, I've often got my hand on the manual focus so that if the camera has any trouble, I just turn manual focus and I can acquire the subject. On this lens, it's kind of at the front, and I can rest my hand on the lens and I can just turn it. It's quite comfortable. Whereas on the 100-500, it's actually around the other way. So on this lens, the zoom ring is at the front, and the manual focus ring is at the back by the mount here. So if I'm shooting, I'm actually trying to change the manual focus, you know, with this hand being quite close, and it's just awkward. It's much better on this lens than that one. So I guess due to all these buttons on this lens, the manual focus ring is actually not as big as I would like, and it's actually bigger on this 100-400. So the actual throw of the zoom ring feels beautiful. If I'm shooting one turn to go from 100-400. Lens does feature Canon's awesome image stabilisation. I think the lens has 5.5 stops, 6 stops with the camera and body. Look, in the real world, you don't get 6 stops, you know, and it's not as important for wildlife because we need high shutter speeds anyway, but I'll look into that a little bit more later in the video. So another amazing feature of this lens is its minimum focus distance. It's kind of like a macro lens. I can get to within a meter or 3 feet of the subject and still be able to focus at 400 millimeters. And you can see on the screen with me mate Gary the Galah, we've got one shot at 3.5 meters and the other shot at minimum focus distance. And you can see at minimum focus distance, we've pretty much got an eyeball. And this is going to have great benefit for photographing smaller things later on, like bees and spiders and things like that. And I've got some really cool photos to share with you later on about the macro capabilities of this lens. So I'm not sure how they get these magnification numbers, but on the screen you can see this is how it compares to other 100-400 lenses. And I think it's class leading for a full frame body. I think only the micro four thirds lens actually has more magnification in this zoom range. As I mentioned, this video is sponsored by Skillshare. If you're not aware of what Skillshare is, it's an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes covering topics such as photography, filmmaking, making it a great place to get inspired and learn new skills. I actually did try out Skillshare myself. I actually went on there, and I have an interest obviously in filmmaking and YouTube. So I put in YouTube into the search bar and I've hit enter, and a whole heap of classes came up, over 2,000 different classes. The one that caught my eye is by a well-known YouTuber called Marcus Brownlee. He was kind enough to share his entire process of how he scripts videos, shoots them, edits them, and I found it really worthwhile. So I've implemented a few of his ideas already. I'm actually using Google Keep now to keep a list of all the shots that I need to take during a video. I listed all the questions you had about this lens. If you're interested in joining and becoming a member, there is a link in the description which offers 1,000 people free and unlimited use to Skillshare for an entire month. So if you want to check out some classes on photography, filmmaking, whatever it is, jump down, hit that link. So thanks again to Skillshare for making this video possible. So it's time to share some photos with you and show you the IQ and sharpness of the lens. Before I do that though, it's important that you understand there's way more to a photo than just the IQ and the sharpness. And if you watched my previous video, you would have seen just how important the light is and how close you are to the subject. At the end of the day, the gear is only as good as the person behind the camera. And if you're struggling with your IQ, your sharpness, I've got a few other videos you can feel free to watch to help you improve those parts of your photography. Let's start off with one of my favorite shots I took whilst using this lens, and it was of the iconic laughing kookaburra. What's your immediate reaction when you see this photo? Like, how does it make you feel? What are you thinking? For me, I just love how the gum trees sort of frame the bird. We've got a nice side angle, and it's just really Australian to me, and it just typifies bird and its habitat. What is interesting though is I doubt very many of you said, oh, look at the IQ and the sharpness of that shot. I doubt that was one of the first things that popped into your mind. And it's probably for good reason, because this shot was actually taken with a 2x converter, and when we zoom in, it's actually pretty soft and noisy and lacking detail. I actually had to do a fair bit of post-processing with this. What this shows though is that sharpness isn't everything, and the composition, the feel, and the makeup of the shot is actually probably more important than how sharp your lens is. But in saying that, we do want to know how sharp this is. So I think we need to break down this lens into the 4 main categories that I see this lens is useful for. Those being macro, landscapes, general wider wildlife, and of course birds. First, we're going to start with macro and just see what this class-leading magnification can give us. So I was actually out watering my garden when I spotted this garden orb spider that had caught itself a dragonfly and was having a big breakfast. I grabbed my camera, got nice and close, and took this shot of the spider actively feeding on the dragonfly. Pretty incredible when you zoom in and see the detail. Whilst it's not a true macro lens, I think this shot does demonstrate what this lens is capable of and can capture intimate close-up shot. The next shot was actually very opportunistic, and I was actually finished my session at the lake and I was walking back to my truck when I noticed bees feeding on a grevillea that was in full flower. My first job was to try and find a flower that was isolated. I was happy that I had some light coloured mulch for our background. I then spent a good 20 minutes taking a number of different shots at different focal lengths and different angles. I started a bit wider at 238mm to include a bit more foliage and habitat, and I liked how it framed the central subject of the flowers and the bees. I then decided to zoom into 400mm to see just how much detail we could capture. This was a little tricky as I had a lot of trouble getting the head sharp as we had such a narrow depth of field, and the IAF of the Canon mirrorless bodies doesn't actually work with bees, so I had to manually put the focus point on the bee and just hope for the best. But I took a lot of shots and got lucky when this bee climbed onto the front of the flower and was actively feeding when I actually grabbed this shot. The fact these shots are even possible with a telephoto lens really does open up the opportunities for the photographer. And you can see how the focal length really does change the composition when we compare 100mm to 400mm. And one last shot of a very cool little spider we have in Australia called the jewel spider. I spotted the spider actively building its web and managed to position myself with a nice background. It's such a unique looking spider, and I was really happy to get this shot. Overall, I was really impressed with the macro capabilities. I must admit, since I've got a zoom lens, I've really started to get interested in butterflies and insects and spiders and bees and all that sort of thing that I just ignored before with my big prime because it was just too difficult. So these zoom lenses definitely enable you to take up macro and get some of these cool shots. So another fantastic use for this lens is actually landscapes. Now, I'm no Thomas Heaton, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know that focal range of 100 to 400 is very popular with landscape photographers. So I decided to try for myself and just take some shots around my property and when I was out taking photos of birds. So the first shot I want to share with you was actually from the front of my house on my veranda. We had a beautiful sunrise and the sun was coming up, and it was sort of behind a gum tree. So I've actually used 100mm, which is our widest focal length, and I've managed to take this shot. And I was really happy with how this turned out. You know, we've got some nice color coming through from the sunrise. We've got the gum tree there, and we've got a few hills in the background. So overall, pretty happy with that shot. Later that evening, the moon, we had a full moon and it was sort of behind some clouds. So I've zoomed right out to 400mm, focused on the moon, took some shots, and we got this one of a sort of the moon behind some clouds, which was pretty moody, pretty cool. The next trip I actually went out to a local wetlands, and this is well known for having lots of these dead trees. And again, when the sun was coming up, I was taking a range of shots, and there was actually a cockatoo that was flying above the trees. I'm not sure if you can see that little cockatoo there, but that's a real bird and habitat, that shot, that's for sure. But again, it came up pretty well. And the fact we had 400mm, and I think this is the focal length most landscape photographers want, is it enables you to zoom in and onto a subject and capture those sort of really intimate details. And you can see in this shot here, I think this is the kind of shots my wife wants me to take, not birds, but you know, this one came up pretty cool. We've got all these backlit trees and we've got that beautiful rich orange color. And again, it's just something interesting that you can take with this lens before the sun comes up and before you can photograph birds. So if you shoot landscapes, you've always wanted a 400mm lens, but they've been too expensive and too heavy. Well, this could be the answer for you. This could be a lens that just sits in your backpack, but when you need that 400mm, pull it out, get those different types of shots. For its price and its weight, I just don't think it can be beaten, to be honest. All right, so it's time to talk about general wildlife. And I believe this is the strength of the lens. That's sort of those wider habitat shots, kangaroos, bigger animals, just wildlife in its habitat. That's where this lens excels. And I'll be honest, this zoom lens has made me be more creative. It's made me think outside the box. For too long, I've just been at 700mm with my prime, getting, frame filling shots of birds with out of focus backgrounds. And I have tried to challenge myself and get some more interesting photos, and I'm thankful and grateful that these zoom lenses have enabled me to do that. And so the first shot I want to share with you is a shot I took before the sun had come up. I was at a lake and there were a couple of ibis sitting in a dead tree. Now I've underexposed the shot, which has brought out those moody clouds in the background. And it's just an interesting shot that I probably would have overlooked before, and I was pretty happy with that. I just finished photographing some grebes when I noticed I had a passenger on my shoulder, and I looked down and there was a really big stick insect sitting on my shoulder. It must have thought I was a big tree or something. So I've gently taken the stick insect off my shoulder and I've put it on a nearby eucalypt, and I've framed up the shot, taken this photo, and it actually worked out pretty well and pretty cool in a unique way to get a shot of a stick insect, I must admit. So the 400mm and the wider depth of field has actually allowed me to capture a really unique shot of the majestic wedge-tailed eagle. This eagle was actually sitting on a dead branch overlooking its surroundings, and I couldn't get that close, but this is the shot I was able to get, and I'm really happy with how this has turned out. It's kind of like a painting. However, I must admit I had to do a lot of editing to this shot to get it how I liked it. So maybe consider this as more of a digital art photo than a true photo, but it sort of shows you the types of backgrounds and compositions that you can get with this lens. So I also believe that 100mm is more useful than say 150 or 200mm for those wider habitat type shots. You can see on the screen here, I was photographing this ibis which was on this dead tree. At 100mm we include a lot of habitat. And just simply turning the zoom ring to 400mm means we've now got a much bigger bird and we've got a completely different composition. And again, I do like this because it holds my gaze, and that's what we want. You're looking at it going, oh, that's interesting, what's going on? We can see the clouds, etc. So that's sort of what we're going for. So every morning I go for a walk before the sun comes up, and I often encounter kangaroos feeding in the grass. I happen to take the camera and lens along with me. They've looked up at me and I've just taken some shots. This was really low light, so I think I was at 1/80th of a second before the sun had come up. The autofocus, the IAF worked really well, and I rattled off a number of shots. And whilst the IQ is lacking because we didn't have the light, I did like the composition and the feel of the shot with that little one looking behind the older one. Now, the beauty of living in the bush is you encounter wildlife even doing your day-to-day chores. I was actually hanging out the washing when I've disturbed a lace monitor or tree goanna, and it's gone up to the nearest eucalypt, which is not far from my washing line. So I've run inside, I've got my lens and camera, I've come back out and I've photographed the monitor as it was still in the tree checking me out. Now the light was a bit harsh and the shadows were a bit difficult, so I've sort of walked around the tree to try and get a different angle, and we came up with this composition here with the goanna with its eye looking at us, and you can see its big claw on the tree. It's just something different and something interesting. And don't worry, I did finish hanging out the washing. It watched me the entire time, and then I went inside and it went off on its way. Overall, it was just a pleasure to use for wildlife in general, and getting these habitat type shots. That's definitely where it excels. Okay, so how does it perform as a dedicated birding lens? Well, it's good and bad. For me personally, 400mm is just too short on a full frame body. We always wish we had more reach. And I encountered that pretty much straight away when I went to the lake and there was a grebe on a nest in the lake. At 400mm, the bird was just too small and there was just no way I could get any closer. So that's the image I was left with. And with my 700mm prime, I would have got a much better shot. And I encountered this a number of times where I was photographing ducks and birds and different things, and I was thinking, gee, I wish I had my 700mm, because at 400, I'm just not getting the detail and the size of the bird that I want. And you can see on the screen the difference between the 700mm that I usually use with my prime and the 400mm of the zoom lens. And what that means is we just have to get a lot closer. And you can see on the screen, I've got a shot at 3.5 meters with the zoom and 8 meters with the prime. So we almost have to get twice as close with the zoom to get the same sort of framing as the prime lens. And that can be an issue with birds because they often just fly away. So with 400mm, you're always going to be challenging yourself to get those sort of shots because you just can't get close enough. Now, this doesn't mean you can't get really nice shots at 400mm with this lens. I did go and visit that grebe from a previous video, and this was a tame grebe, so I could get pretty close, and it enabled us to get this shot, which I really quite like. You know, we've got a little bit of the habitat in the background, we've got a nice reflection, resolution, nice colors, overall a really, really nice shot. But when we compare it to the shots I got with my prime lens, I was able to get these this headshot, frame filling shot. It just looks completely different. I think we just need to understand that your focal length, your aperture, and how close you are to the subject will largely determine how that photo looks. And with 400mm f8, it's never going to compare to the 600 6.3s or the 700 5.6, and you just have to accept that and understand that you're not going to get those type of shots with this lens. But in saying that, if you can get close to your subject, you're going to get really good detail, great IQ, and I did that with this Pacific black duck. In fact, it came so close I actually had to zoom out a little bit. And as we can see, the details is just amazing. And the funny thing is, I would not have been able to get this shot with a prime because it came within the minimum focus distance. So, you know, in this scenario, the zoom actually gave me that benefit of getting this shot. And I also shared this shot in my last video of a little fairy wren, which is currently calling at the moment. The bird looks great. It was on a salt bush. You know, I've processed it. It's come up well. Plenty of detail. Very happy with this shot. Ultimately though, as I mentioned before, 400mm was just too short. I went to a lake and I encountered these beautiful pink-haired ducks. Not a common bird in Australia. And I thought, oh, this is amazing. I'm gonna get some nice shots. But at 400mm, all I was getting was these wider group shots. And these are quite nice, but I was hoping to get that extra detail. You know, I was hoping to get the bird filling the frame. Just wasn't possible. Okay, so one way we can increase our focal length is to use converters, and we do have two RF teleconverters. We have the 2x and we have the 1.4. So if we add a 1.4 to this lens, it becomes a 560 f11, and if we add the 2x, it becomes an 800 f16. Now the autofocus does work with both extenders. However, our autofocus coverage shrinks as we add them, and then with the 2x, it becomes really, really small and actually quite difficult to use. Now the biggest issue with these teleconverters is just their price. They're so expensive. This 2x is almost exactly the same price as this entire lens. So the value proposition changes if you're adding these converters because it just makes it a lot more expensive. So let's have a look at how these converters change our field of view. Like how much more reach does it give us? All right, let's take a look at the 1.4 converter first. So on the screen, as you can see, it does make quite a difference to our field of view. And when we zoom in, there is an advantage to that converter, and there's actually a lot more detail in the subject. So now we're actually a stop slower at f11, so we've lost half the amount of light. So we'll obviously need to increase our ISO or drop our shutter speed to maintain that exposure. And that is the issue when you add these extenders, you're actually losing light, so it becomes more and more of an issue in low light. So the other thing to be aware of is your IQ will take a bit of a hit when using converters. So I did take a lot of shots using the converters, so let's have a look at those now. So with the 1.4, we get even more magnification for macros, so I was really happy to grab this cabbage butterfly as it was feeding on this beautiful yellow flower, just like the composition of this shot. A little corella actually landed on a branch reasonably low, and I was able to capture this lovely over-the-shoulder pose with the bird looking at me, and we had those eucalypt leaves there adding a little bit of context. I was happy with how this one turned out. And I know I get asked a lot about bird in flight. People are always asking me about this, and it is really difficult to do bird in flight, even with the RF. I must admit the autofocus is much easier with the eye tracking than the old DSLRs, but it's still a challenge. But I went to a location by a lake with lots of birds flying around. Unfortunately, even with the 1.4 converter, I was still struggling for focal length, and one of my favourite looking shots is actually this sulphur crested cockatoo that had this amazing pose, but it was just too far away. Look, it looks okay, small in the frame, but just imagine what the shot would have looked like if we'd had, you know, say my prime 700 5.6 or even more focal length. So the best bird in flight shot I took was this little corella as it was hovering. It had its wings up, and I just really liked the look of the shot. And the 1.4, the autofocus definitely worked at tracking this bird in flight, which was good, and I was overall pretty happy with how this shot turned out. And this headshot of a magpie shows you can get really nice detail when you get really nice and close to the subject. All right, so what about the 2x converter? Well, I must admit it was pretty painful. The autofocus was just a challenge because it was such a small box. And, you know, 800mm, that field of view makes it a little bit trickier to find subjects in the sky and different things. And overall, I did take lots of nice shots, but overall, I would definitely not recommend using it. So the kookaburra I showed earlier, this is the viewfinder footage when I was photographing that handheld. As you can see, the coverage is quite small. We did get the focus point on the eye, but a lot of these shots just weren't up to the standard that I was after. I was able to save a few of the shots, but overall the quality was pretty poor. And obviously at f16, we have a really big depth of field. And now it helps for some shots, but it actually works against you for other shots. So I had these plumed whistling ducks on the lake fantastic bird. I've only ever photographed them once before, so again, I wish I'd had my prime, but I put the 2x on, I had 800mm, and I did actually end up capturing a couple of shots I was happy with. This one here that you can see on the screen, this was probably the pick of the bunch. I did like that we had two birds, and the background wasn't distracting at all, so overall this shot worked. But a lot of the other shots that I took during this session, the background was just too in focus and too distracting for me. And that was the biggest issue at f16, was just you're not going to get those smooth, creamy backgrounds. But again, of course, if we have really nice light and we're really close, you're going to get pretty good detail. And you can see on this little Corella portrait, looks pretty good to me. You know, we had direct sunlight, so the feather detail's good, the IQ's good, but you're not going to encounter these tame birds in good light all the time. That's pretty much the only time you would use this, is in direct sunlight with close subjects. It kind of defeats the purpose, because you often want to use one of these to make a small bird bigger. If you do that, you're just probably going to end up being disappointed. I think you'd probably be better off to get an RF800 f11, to be honest. Maybe have the two lenses, one for small birds and then one for the general macro and landscape, etc. So that would probably be a better option than spending a fortune on this 2x RF converter. Another positive with this lens is it actually performed really well wide open at f8 or f11 or whatever it was. I didn't see a huge difference when I stopped this lens down, which is what I recommend. And I think that helps us, because f8 is already pretty slow. So I'd have no issue at all shooting at f8. And in fact, the majority of the shots I took were at f8. And on the screen, we can see the difference between f8 and f11. And when we zoom into 100%, you know, we do get a bit more depth of field, but the sharpness in IQ is very, very similar. Alright, so it's probably worth mentioning how that f8 impacts us with low light. When we shoot in low light at f8, we're going to have pretty high ISO and pretty low shutter speeds. Because if we had a faster lens like this 500 f4, this is 2 stops faster. It lets in 4 times as much light. What that means is we can have higher shutter speeds and lower ISO when we use a faster lens. And that's the battle you encounter with this lens in the bush. So what I did is I actually photographed these sawfly larvae after the sun had gone down, very low light. I started off at f8, which meant I had a very low shutter speed and a pretty high ISO. Now I did take some shots and they came out okay, but if I then changed to f4, I actually had 2 more stops. And you can see when we compare the shot of the sawfly larvae at f8 and when we compare it at f4, we get quite a difference in how it looks. And look, there's just no way around that. With this lens, you're going to have to shoot at really low shutter speeds, which is going to introduce motion blur, camera shake, and you'll just have some issues. So just be prepared. If you do use this lens in low light, you're going to have some issues with noise and shutter speeds. And if you use an extender, it's going to be even worse, because it goes to f11 or f16. So just something you need to be aware of when shooting in low light. Okay, let's talk about the autofocus, and let me just say it's excellent. These RF lenses on the R5 and R6, the autofocus is just impeccable. The eye tracking works, it's fast, it's sharp, it's accurate, it's just a pleasure to use. And it's a big jump from the DSLR days and those EF lenses. They just work better and you'll get more sharp photos. So even though this is a budget lens, it actually uses Canon's Nano USM. I don't fully understand what that is, but I believe it's a step up from the STM lenses. And it's pretty impressive that they've put such a good focusing motor in this budget lens. And it definitely shows, because it's super fast. And I didn't notice a huge difference between this and the 100-500. Perhaps the 100-500 stays on the subject a little bit more. But look, I found this to be very, very fast and very, very accurate, which was a really good thing. So to put the autofocus to the test, I thought we'd go out and take some shots of bird in flight. Now I got lucky when I came across a flock of little corellas that were feeding in a suburban area, so they're not that afraid of humans. I actually had some nice wind, which was helping them hover. And as you can see through the viewfinder, the eye tracking just picks up the eye of the bird even when it's flying and just follows it around. And it's quite amazing at just how accurate this is at finding the bird and sticking to it. Took lots of shots and we managed to get quite a few in-flight shots. The first one, as you can see, I kind of like this hovering pose because the wings are out, the bird's looking at us, the detail is fine. I actually took this with the 1.4 converter, so the autofocus worked well even with the converter attached. Overall, took lots of different photos, took some shots of some galahs. The tracking just works. However, I had that issue of just not being quite close enough, so the detail wasn't quite there. These galahs, I would have liked to have been a bit closer, but overall pretty happy and impressed with how the autofocus worked in this regard. And I did even do a test with Gary the galah. You can see on the screen I've gone from the owl to the galah to the background, from the background to the galah, and I actually found this lens didn't suffer from the background lock as bad as my big prime and the 100-500. Perhaps because of that depth of field, the subject isn't as out of focus, but I found the autofocus to be excellent. I did still lock onto the background occasionally doing that macro, and you just obviously use the manual focus override to overcome that, but I really can't complain with the autofocus of this lens. Alrighty, so the image stabilization, it's awesome. It works really well with the Canon. As I mentioned earlier, it's just got the one mode. It's either on or it's off. And when we look on the screen, we can see just what a difference it makes. We can see what it's like with it on and what it's like with it off. Just makes it a lot more pleasurable to look through the viewfinder when you've got that level of stabilization. All right, so the lens is rated at 5.5 stops or 6 stops, meaning you can shoot at really low shutter speeds. And I did take some shots at low shutter speeds. I shot this moon at 1/30th of a second handheld, and it's sharp. However, when we start trying to photograph subjects that are moving, like these sawfly larvae, they were on this leaf, so it was moving. I just struggled big time to get any sharp shots at those slow, really slow shutter speeds, just because of that movement. And to me, anything under 1/100th of a second is too slow. I would always want to be above that to try and limit motion blur. And most of the time, I'm trying to be over 1/400th of a second. So the IS isn't really helping us in that regard. It's helping steady the viewfinder, but we don't really want to shoot at low shutter speeds anyway. But I guess in low light, if you had to, there is that advantage. And the other benefit of the IS is you can definitely shoot handheld video with this lens. All the footage you've seen in today's video was actually shot handheld. Okay, so let's talk about value for money and how it compares to other lenses. Before we do that, it's really important that we actually break these lenses down into 4 categories, because I believe they are different. In the first category, we'll call that the A category. This is all your super telephoto lenses. These are your 500 and your 600 f4s, the 500 5.6. These lenses offer you a lot of focal length. They're very fast, they're very expensive, and they're at that top tier, at A tier. At B tier, I would say these are all our 5 and 600mm zoom lenses. So these are our 100-500. These are our 200-600, 150-600. They offer us quite a lot of focal length, you know, sort of that mid-speed, about 6.3. And then below that, we've got our C tier. And in the C tier, I would say are your 100-400, your 400mm zoom lenses, such as this 100-400, maybe the 70-300s. Just that sort of 300-400mm range would be our C tier. And then the D tier would be your really short zooms, so your 70-200s, kit lens, the 250 kit lenses. Those are at the very bottom, and it's very difficult to use those for wildlife. So this lens here obviously sits in the C tier, and within the C tier, we can even break that down into sort of budget sub 1,000 US lenses and above 1,000. So this lens sits in definitely that bottom half of the C tier. And down there, it doesn't have a lot of competition. The only other lenses it competes with down there are the Tamron and the Sigma 100-400 6.3 lenses. Now those are actually 2 really good options. They are around $100 more expensive, but they are a little bit faster at 6.3. However, they weigh significantly more than this. They don't have the same RF autofocus abilities that this lens has. They're bigger. So for me personally, I would probably always go with the RF mount because it's native and it's just much lighter, and for me it just offers better value for money. So for me it's a little bit difficult to compare this lens directly to the EF100-400 version 2. That's an L series lens. There are some differences. On the screen you can see the size and weight difference. The EF version on an EF body weighs over 1 kilo more, so it's much heavier. Price difference is just extraordinary. The EF lens is over 3 times as expensive, so that's a big consideration. So I guess if you had the money and you wanted the IQ, the EF is probably going to offer you better IQ. But if you were more interested in the weight and the price, then this would be a clear winner. So the other lens people are asking me to compare it with is the RF100-500, the other zoom lens in the RF mount. Again, not a fair comparison. This lens I think is 4 times as expensive. It's twice as heavy, but it does give us that extra 100mm of focal length. This is a beautiful lens. It's super sharp. It is light, but not as light as that one, and overall very impressed with this lens. But they're just not in the same bracket. And when we compare them, we can have a look at Gary the Galah. That 100mm extra gives us, you know, just that more reach, and we do get a little bit of image quality. However, when we compare them at 400mm, the difference isn't as big as you would expect. The IQ of this little 100-400 is just impressing me, even when compared to the much more expensive 100-500. So I think it's also worth mentioning the major design flaw of the 100-500. When you add a converter to this lens, you actually lose the 100-300mm focal range. So when I zoom back in, I can only go to 300mm. I cannot go back to 100. That's it. So if I leave the converter on, I've got to carry it round like that. That's as small as it will go. And it's really, really annoying that you have to take the converter off for it to then retract all the way in. Alrighty, so I've put the 1.4 converter on the 100-400, and look at that, we get the full coverage. So we still have 100-400, and we can carry it around all the way retracted. Okay, so how that impacts our focal range is this becomes a 140-560, I think, but this here becomes 420 to 700. So we sort of lose that wider focal length when we use a 1.4 converter on this. So definitely an advantage to the cheaper budget lens in terms of extenders. So a lot of people have asked me to compare this lens with extenders to the Sigma 600 6.3, and thankfully my good mate Brian met up with me and enabled me to take some test shots. Now that lens is 3 times as heavy, it's much bigger, and it's in a different tier. It's in tier B, this is a tier C, so they are slightly different lenses with different value propositions. But if you want to know what they look like, let's have a look on the screen. And as we can see, the difference is just enormous. At 8 meters, we've got 600 6.3, and on the right, we've got 400 f8. And there really is no way around this difference. The focal length just makes the subject bigger and more out of focus. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, you can use the 1.4. So what does it look like at 560 f11 compared to the Sigma? Well, I did that. And on the screen, we can see now the bird is much bigger at 560, but our background is still suffering because we're now at f11 compared to 6.3. The Sigma still looks better. So the other important thing is we can actually put a 1.4 converter on the Sigma and it becomes an 840 f9. And when we compare those two together, we can see that the Sigma is just way ahead of this in terms of making that subject bigger and having our out of focus background. But I guess it's important to note that that Sigma has some autofocus issues, and I did an entire review on that lens, which you're free to check out. For me personally, I'm almost tempted to wait for Sigma and Tamron to figure out the RF mount before I went out buying the Sigma. I know many of you take really good shots on your R5 and R6 with the Sigma, but just be prepared that the autofocus is nowhere near as good as the RF lenses. It's just something you need to be aware of if you purchase that Sigma lens. Funnily enough, while I was taking the photos of Gary the Galah, we actually had a magpie jump up and offer his services, and he stood right next to Gary. I took a few shots, so that was a bit of a funny moment during the morning. So the last lens I want to compare it with is the trusty 400 5.6. As you know, this was my first wildlife lens. I'm never going to sell it. This lens is really light. I think it's 1.2 kilos, but it's twice the weight of this. It is quite fast at 5.6, where this is f8, and this is super sharp, so it's a lovely sharp lens. But this lens does have its weaknesses. It does not have IS, so we're going to get that shaky viewfinder when we're using the body, and we'll also need higher shutter speeds than we would with this. And at minimum focus distance is also 3.5 meters, meaning we can't get really close. Even at distance, there's a big difference between 5.6 and f8 in terms of our background and how out of focus it is. So again, that's a bit of a stylistic choice, and this will help you in low light. So at the end of the day, I guess for a dedicated birding lens, this one here is probably going to offer you slightly better quality, slightly better background. It's faster, but you're not really going to be able to do macro with this lens. It doesn't have that IS, you don't have the versatile zoom range, and the autofocus is a little bit slower. Even though this is a fast autofocus lens, this one's is just better because it's RF. It just focuses much quicker than this one. So an interesting debate. For me personally, I would go with this one just because it's offers more, it's lighter, autofocus is better. Just overall, this is just a better value proposition than this, in my opinion. One important thing is worth mentioning in this review video is how this lens is going to go on the upcoming APS-C bodies from Canon. That means that this lens is going to have a different field of view. It's going to go from 100 to 400, it's going to go to 160 to 640. So 640mm field of view is a lot different to 400. And on the screen, I put the R5 into its 1.6 crop mode, and you can see the difference that this crop factor makes. The subject is just going to be a lot bigger. And this may make this lens more viable to many of you who want that reach, because the crop body is just going to assist you. Now, you're probably going to say, oh, you can just crop a full frame, and yes, you can, but the file is going to be a lot different. The R7 is likely going to be around 32 megapixels, the R5 is around 17 megapixels in crop mode, and I believe the R6 is around 7.8 or something like that, so a lot less. So that crop body is going to create a much bigger subject, and it's worth considering when you buy this lens that you could potentially get that body in the future to help with your reach. So in regards to other bodies, unfortunately I didn't test this on the RP or the R because I don't have access to those, but I did test it on the R5 and the R6, and it worked almost identically on those two bodies. I didn't have any change in autofocus. It worked well, the files, the quality were excellent. So I have no doubt that this lens will work well on every single RF body that Canon makes. Okay, so that brings us to who is this lens for? Well, if you want to take macro shots, landscape shots, wildlife shots, and shots of birds, and you want a lens that's affordable, that's light, has good autofocus, has good IS, then this is perhaps the lens for you. Small birds is your go and you really want reach, then perhaps this isn't the lens for you. Maybe a 100-500 or a 600 zoom, or just wait for the R7 or wait for Tamron and Sigma to come out with their lenses. It's basically one lens is not going to do everything for you, and you need to make a choice. Maybe the RF800 is an option to pair with this, and it all comes down to your style and what you want. So in conclusion, this lens, as you can probably tell, has impressed me a lot. The fact I got all those photos I shared today with this $695 lens shows you that wildlife photography is no longer in the realms of our big $10,000 lenses. You don't have to buy those super expensive lenses to get into wildlife photography and to have fun and get out there. This lens will do it. All we need now is an affordable body and the RF mount to match this affordable lens, and then people can really get involved with the mirrorless setup. So I hope today's review answered any questions you might have had about the 100-400. If I've missed anything, leave a comment below. I will answer it, or somebody else will answer it. Let me know which images you liked from today's session, and maybe just share a link to the photos that you've taken with this lens so other people can check it out. Just be aware though, if you post a comment with a link on YouTube, I need to approve it first so it won't show up straight away. I will also add all the images I've shared today on my gallery, so they're all in one place, so you can go and check that out. There'll be a link in the description. And lastly, please consider becoming a member of my channel. What that means is for the price of less than a cup of coffee per month, it directly supports me to make these long content, these in-depth reviews, and it just really does assist me. Thank you to my already wonderful existing members. Thank you to everyone who subscribes to me. Thanks to everyone who watches these videos. Without my wonderful audience, none of this would be possible, and I truly am grateful for all that support. Obviously, give it a thumbs up if you like this content. Subscribe if you want to see more of them. Until the next video, take care, happy birding, and see you later. Weighs around 635 grams, which is literally nothing. Kookaburras. Okay, so let's have a talk about the actual lens itself. You know, this is going to fit in most camera backpacks. Obviously give it a Obviously give it a thumbs up if you like this content. Subscribe